All right, it is a big day here at FingerLakes1.com. Welcome back, everyone, to the Debrief podcast. I'm Josh Durso, joined in studio by my co-host and soon co-worker, Ted Baker. He's the longtime host of Finger Lakes Morning News on Finger Lakes News Radio, but recently agreed to leave behind his terrestrial radio roots and join the digital wave here at Finger Lakes One. We're going to be getting into the biggest headlines of the week, as always, but first, we do need to talk about all the things that are going to be changing here. Obviously, first and foremost, welcome, Ted. Ted's going to be joining us as a content manager. You're going to be seeing him produce news segments, whether they're audio, video, written. He's also going to be calling some high school sports for us over the next several months. You're going to see a lot of them during basketball season. That's just the way it goes around here. But first, thanks for being here, and welcome aboard.
Thank you for the opportunity. 15 years of 4 a.m. wake-ups. Obviously that takes its toll a little bit, especially when you're doing high school sports and getting home at 10:15 and getting up at 4. But I've admired Finger Lakes One for a long time, worked with you. I come here every week. I've known Jim for a long time. And I wasn't seeking the opportunity. You guys came to me and said, hey, we're growing, and we think you can be a big part of it. And I started getting excited again. It's like, because all these ideas are percolating around now, so you'll see them come to fruition here in these weeks to come.
Before we get into all the other things that are changing or set to change here in the next few weeks here at Finger Lakes One, I want to ask you, because I'm sure this is the question you've gotten a lot, and this is the question that's been thrown at me, that I was curious what your answer would be now that the move is happening. Why make this change at this point in your career?
Well, I'm 61 years old. I figure I'm probably going to be working another 10 years or more. Frankly, I'll probably be dragged out by the feet at age 92 or something from the studio. I liked the opportunity. Two things. The morning wakes is part of it. Also, at Finger Lakes News Radio, I'm program director, which involves a lot of responsibilities and a lot of, frankly, middle management headaches. And I thought it might be nice to not have to worry about whether someone else did something or showed up or didn't do something, or whether I remembered to make this change or this setting or that setting. So now I'm kind of in charge of me. I like your work atmosphere here, the way we talked about it when we had lunch the other day. I've liked working with you. Like I said, I know and like Jim. It seemed like the right thing. It just seemed, and frankly, at a time when local media websites are not doing very much, you have been, and I see the growth potential the way that you and Jim do, and so I thought, hey, this is something that it's going to be fun.
Yeah. And it definitely is going to be that. So later today, we'll have a full announcement published on the website, FingerLakes1.com, outlining all of the changes that are coming to the content team here. Ted isn't the only awesome person, obviously, who's joined the team in recent weeks and months. Paul Russo, who's producing this podcast right now across the room from me, he joined about a month ago or so. He's handling all of our live events. He's managing the studio, and he's obviously also going to have a big role in basketball season. Samantha Goodman, she has been basically working directly with me every day on the written content side. She's been absolutely instrumental in getting us to the place where we are now, where we can start adding top talent like you, like Paul, like all the other people who we are going to be able to bring on in the next 6 months to a year. So, of course, all good news there on that front. We're really excited about that. Side note for those who have been reading along on Finger Lakes One for the last few years and grown accustomed to reading people like Todd Elzey, Peter Mantius, Gabe Petrazio, they're all going to remain mainstays at Finger Lakes One. You're going to continue seeing their content as long as they continue to be interested in working with us and working for us. So that will be a continuation of what has always been. As far as Ted coming on board, I'll say this, as from my vantage point, this is going to give us a really great opportunity to expand the local side of things, expand the audio, the video, and of course the written components of what we do here at FingerLakes1.com. So really, really good stuff. Outside of that, anything else you want to add about this changeover and what you're thinking in terms of moving forward? Obviously, he and I are still going to be doing the podcast every week, the Debrief podcast. There are plans eventually. Ted will have his own show that we'll be doing on a regular basis. So those things will be happening, but that's where we stand right now.
Definitely increased beer coverage. I'm looking forward to that. We need to have some sort of podcast and or blog about craft beverages in the area. I just want to say that I'm not leaving the Finger Lakes Radio Group out of any upset or lack of enthusiasm about that job. This one, when you guys presented it to me, just seemed perfect, and I'm coming up on 19 years. That's a long time with one company, 15 years of doing the morning show. So I've gotten a tremendous amount of support. I posted on Facebook the other day that I was leaving, people I've crossed paths with. I'm very happy with what we've done at Finger Lakes News Radio, and they'll do well. They'll find someone else, and they'll move on, and they'll continue to grow. But you're growing in leaps and bounds. I mean, there aren't very many media outlets that are bringing new people on these days. So looking forward to it. I appreciate the old, and I'm looking forward to the new.
Yeah, and one side note, for me personally, I'm going to be stepping in as Vice President of Content here at Finger Lakes One. So you'll still see me on podcasts, but you're probably going to see less of me in terms of byline coverage. So for those who have reached out, and a lot of people have reached out over the last 6 to 8 months, I've kind of stepped back from doing a lot of the on-the-ground reporting that I had historically been doing before that. There will still be times when I step in and dust off the fingertips, so to speak, and throw my byline out there, but a little less of that moving forward. Anyway, we've got news to talk about. Believe it or not, despite all of these awesome things happening here at Finger Lakes One, still lots of news happening in the Finger Lakes, starting with the Sheriff's Office in Ontario County. And this is a topic that we've talked about now at least 2 or 3 times in the last month and a half, because you had the resignation of Kevin Henderson, who said he wasn't going to resign, but ultimately did resign because of hostile work environment concerns, also allegations of sexual harassment, although those have seemed to have really fallen to the wayside. Every time I see this reported now, it seems to be very focused on the hostile work environment, which is both vague and I guess a little bit concerning at the same time. But Sheriff Pavro, 2 years out, he's back in, at least for the rest of this year, and then the duration of 2022, it seems. Does this solve the Sheriff's Office's problems going forward? Does bringing someone like Sheriff Pavro in, who held the position of sheriff for 27 years before he retired, does that go far enough to kind of fixing maybe some of the issues that have arisen over the last 2 years? Or is 2 years too long an amount of time, do you think?
No, I think it helps things for the interim. I mean, the fact that he came back is interesting enough. I mean, after 2 years, long career, I think he must really have a strong love for that department and was probably hurt to see its name dragged into the mud.
Yep.
And so I think, I don't know all the internal politics of the Sheriff's Department, but to the best of my knowledge, he's well-liked, well-respected. I talked to him monthly for years and years. I did an hour-long talk with him when he retired. So I think he's going to be a good steadying influence while the search goes on, and hopefully they'll take an internal look at what was going on and fix it so it doesn't go on in the future.
And of course, obviously, the Sheriff's Office is an elected position, and we will see what I assume to be a contested race next year with 2 fresh faces. I don't see a scenario where Sheriff Pavro decides that he's going to run for another full term. So it's interesting. I think my curiosity is, at what point does everything that happened over the last 2 years under Sheriff Kevin Henderson come back to roost for whatever Democratic candidate steps forward? Because let's not forget, politics is politics, and as much as we might like to believe that politics won't be exactly like politics that we've seen over the last 4, 5, 6, 7 years, we know otherwise. We're smart enough to know otherwise. So between that aspect of this, which I'm really curious about, and the transparency part of it, which is where you and I focused a lot of our attention, there's still an investigation playing out within the county. It doesn't really seem like there are too many external forces involved. It doesn't seem like, and it's, I guess, an interesting wrinkle here is that despite the ever-growing commonality of seeing, the Attorney General's office or a state agency being involved in local investigations when there is some sort of malfeasance or wrongdoing committed, doesn't seem like there's any appetite whatsoever to make that happen here or a request of that. So it's kind of curious to me. I part of me wonders if this is just going to slowly but surely just kind of fade into the horizon, or if this is going to be something that, even though Sheriff Pavro is back in the fold, this stays in the forefront and the public really gets some serious answers.
I think, actually, truth be told, I think it'll fade rather quickly, because I think there's just a tendency to want to put things like this behind you. The public has a short attention span. There'll be other stories in the news. Sheriff Pavro's back. He should be a steadying influence. Remember, a lot of the people who were disgruntled with the Kevin Henderson administration left.
Yeah.
So, whether he brings back, his people, quote unquote, or just serves as more of a caretaker, I was familiar with a lot of the candidates in the last election, and I thought there were some really good quality people. I'm sure some of them will come back, like you said, some new faces. So I think there's no reason why they can't find a very good sheriff and clean up what needs to be cleaned up and move on.
And I'm going to say this is my personal take of elections in general, but I don't think that any sheriff's contest should be excluded from this critique. All too often we see 55, 60, 65, 70-year-old folks running and ultimately winning seats like sheriff. And at the end of the day, while it's a job that I think requires a good bit of experience, I think it shouldn't be lost on folks who want to see some significant or just, a boost to morale or maybe better recruiting or something along those lines, that maybe it's time to look a little younger in terms of what the next sheriff is or could be. Livingston County has a very young sheriff by comparison to virtually every other county in the region. Sheriff Baxter might probably be the next youngest in Monroe County. So it's one of those scenarios where I think, the Finger Lakes has kind of had these long-term influences. You got Pavro, Verts, Yates County, Spike, and Yates County has had a sheriff. So you've got these long-term influences, but I think at some point, when those folks step out, you just hope that the succession is, as it was with them, a younger person stepping up into a role, and really being able to champion that for a long time.
Well, and I think the problem with that is that, like you said, it is an elected position, it's a political position, so I think it's difficult for a young person to build that kind of political base that you need. I mean, the candidates, they're in their 50s and 60s, have been around for a while. They've probably been in different law enforcement agencies. They've moved up through different levels of management, and they probably are better able to build that base of support. So it would be interesting to see that, but I don't know. I think it would be difficult for a young person to break through and get elected to that position.
Well, and I think part of that also, in my opinion anyway, is that we need to see the county parties start to your actual. I'll say the 30 to 40 people who influence who the candidates are the most in each of these counties. I think they need to take a more active role in that too. I think they play a big role in who does or doesn't get to be a candidate. So that's also the thing that weighs. Yes, building that coalition is important, but we've seen candidates in local and otherwise that have a coalition of support in terms of voters, but because they don't have support of the party, they ultimately are unsuccessful.
Well, and that obviously was a big issue in the Buffalo mayor's race, when a lot of the party machinery supported Byron Brown against the expressed wishes of their own party's voters in the primary, who wanted India Walton. So that's why I've talked about on the air, and I know we've had this conversation here, that some of these positions, should they be elected? Should a sheriff be a position you have to run for, or is that a professional position where a committee of competent people should hire him like you'd hire any other top manager of a company, for example?
Yeah, it's a legitimate question, and I think unlike a lot of the other debates around what should or shouldn't be elected, I don't know that I know Tompkins County at least considered it for a short amount of time in terms of what they were going to do with their sheriff, but ultimately did not move in that direction. I think that's a tough. And I think back to what Jackie Augustine had said so many times on this program whenever we brought up something like that was, you can't put the genie back in the bottle after you take that control away from the voter. You can't give it back to them, or it's much harder to give it back to them after you've taken it away from them. So I think that's kind of the, that's probably where most people come down on it, and that's really probably the fear of why it doesn't happen, or shouldn't happen. Highway superintendent is a perfect example, and I think that's the example we always point to. What's the difference between the way a Republican and a Democrat pave a road? There isn't. They're just paving roads. So yes, all of those things are things that we'll be watching over the next 6 to 12 months. We are only 12 months away from the 2022 general election, after all. I mean, come on.
The campaign's only been away for 3 years.
So let's shift gears and talk a little bit about schools in Auburn. There's a vacancy on the Auburn School Board, and this week they failed to make a decision on filling a vacancy. Essentially, they can't figure out, forget about the who, they can't figure out the how. So it's interesting to me that a board or an agency that's responsible for governing has a multitude of options in front of them. Like this is the part to me that seems so strange. Like, obviously the questions that I have for you are like, should residents be concerned about it, and what happens when the wheels of government stop turning completely, because that's almost the scenario you're in here, even though they probably will make a decision. But it's very, very strange to me that there isn't just one process for filling a vacancy. Superintendent Jeff Piazzolo, at their most recent workshop, laid out all the options, and I believe there were either 5 or 6 different options for how they could go about filling the vacancy, with some nuance mixed in there too. That is just an incredibly strange phenomenon, and I'm not really sure I understand why that even exists. Governing bodies should have a pretty clear black and white process for handling all of these administrative tasks.
You would think so, and I mean, the logical one is, unless the term is up in a very short period of time, is to call a special election. I mean, if it's 2 months to the next election, it doesn't make sense to elect somebody for 2 months. But if it's a year out, for example, then you have a special election. The voters choose someone, and then that person has a year to build a record to run on for re-election if they so choose. And it's odd also, we talk about in New York where the state prescribes almost everything. I'm surprised that the state hasn't laid down the law and said, this is how you fill a vacancy.
Yeah, and it's interesting. It does seem like the way they are most likely going to go is to try to go to the next highest vote getter from the previous election, if they do end up filling. I know there are a couple board members that seem interested in just leaving it vacant until the next election cycle, which would be another.
And of course, the other issue is, who in their right mind wants to be on a school board these days? Seriously, I mean, you're dealing with ever militant parents and kids, and masking and COVID issues. It's a difficult, and never mind what we talk about, the financial management that you're in charge of with whatever training. I know they get something, but it's got to be very difficult to come in as a new school board member and try to master the discussions of a school budget, for example.
Yeah, and that's kind of, to me, where the rules of engagement for all of these, and we've seen it with even, I'll say lower level local political offices, town supervisor, village mayor, town council member, city council member. Very little in it for the people who are doing the job, and they have to bear the weight of the entire community, good, bad, or indifferent. And, at the end of the day, I believe it's Geneva City Council members who make something like, $4,000 a year or something to that. If council members make like $8,000 a year, supervisor only makes 10 or 11 structure. But, it's, what's the incentive? And I keep going back to this, is like, what's the incentive for, say, someone in their 20s or 30s or 40s, when they're in the prime of their earning career or working career, to take away from that, especially given the way the economy is overall, or has been for the last 10 or 20 years, and say, I'm going to put 20 to 40 hours a week of my life into being modern day. And school board seats fall into the exact same category. What's the incentive? There is no incentive. There is absolutely no pay associated with being on school board. Adults then complain about, well, the only people who are interested in those seats are those who have kids in the district, or as soon as their kids graduate or leave the school district, they get out and they don't want to be on the Board of Education anymore. So it's like, there was always this very sort of self-directed interest in whether you did or didn't participate in the process. It just seems like it needs to be modernized so that more people do get involved.
And, I mean, it's gotten more combative and more militant at lower and lower levels. I mean, for years, school boards, they voted on the budget, and taxes went up 1 or 2%, and everyone voted. Council races become a referendum on opening or closing the landfill. And it's, you know, I don't know that's happened so much around here, but you hear stories of people, you know, being accosted in their homes, or they're going out trying to have a dinner with their family, and people are coming up and shouting at them. And that's tough because ultimately it doesn't serve us well if good people don't want to be a part of government anymore.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. And I would say probably it's not politics, if not the things that you mentioned, it's the bureaucracy and the flip-flopping and the back and forth. Now, to that end, let's talk about masking in schools. So this week, we've seen the mayor-elect in New York City, a Democrat, say he'd like to see masks be stopped in K-12 environment sooner than later. Governor mentioned now, not only between parties, but between folks inside of the same party, about what the right path is here for when masks should end in schools. So I asked that question to you. When is the right time, if there is a right time? We obviously now are starting to see 5 to 11-year-olds get vaccinated. Is it once everyone is vaccinated? Or do you think there is a chance now at this point, because masks have been a part of the equation for so long, that even after vaccination, that masks remain a requirement in schools? Because I'll tell you what, to me, it's starting to feel that way.
Yeah, I think it is. As far as, you know, if I were king of New York, when it would happen, sooner than later. We talked about this the other day on my program. The pandemic has changed. When someone got COVID in March or April of 2020, we said, oh my God, you know, when someone gets COVID today, we're like, oh, you lucky duck, you get a week off work. I mean, okay, then why are you always discouraging it?
Right.
You know, the freedom issue. All of the things that government makes us do, why this issue? Why is this now where you've decided to plant your flag and cry freedom? I have my liberal lefty opinion on that we don't really need to go through again. But so a lot of it's just the whole political football.
Well, and to that end, one of the other interesting stories that popped up over the last 3 or 4 days is, and I've seen it now everywhere, the Finger Lakes is leading the state in positive cases of COVID. So COVID cases are on the rise again here in the Finger Lakes. And
except,
also,
can I say my little mantra here?
Sure.
Rochester isn't the Finger Lakes. It's not high in the Finger Lakes. It's high in Monroe County. We're the Finger Lakes. You're not. Stop lumping us in with you unvaccinated people.
So,
thank you.
To that end, I would also argue that if vaccination is an issue, or if that's the primary issue, counties like Seneca and Yates and Ontario and Wayne, the rural parts of those communities, are more of a problem than Monroe County.
Well, it's interesting, though, because one of the people I follow on Twitter is Rachel Barnhart, former TV reporter, Monroe County Legislature, and she's been really pushing incentives and kind of like community block parties and things. And in her ward, which I think is right in the middle of the city, it's something like 40%. So there does seem to be, I kind of poo-pooed it for a while, but I think there is an access issue for certain people. There still are people who would like to be vaccinated but can't easily get a ride, I guess, to the latest CVS or nearest CVS or Walmart or whatever. So there's the left-right political part of it, where a lot of people on the right just don't want to do it, I think, is a political statement. But there's also apparently still access issues. We put the poll on our website, fingerlakesdailynews.com. If you're not vaccinated, is it because you don't know how, couldn't do it, or because you don't want it? Early on, it was running something like 90 to 10, I don't want it. As of the last I checked today, it's something like 27% say they want to be vaccinated, but haven't been able to or don't know how. So maybe there's just been a failure in education. Maybe there are people who don't realize that you can walk in to almost any pharmacy and get that vaccination. And of course now we've got the big push for boosters, and so that message is sort of crowding out the push to get first doses for some people.
Yeah, I think so. It's interesting because I think maybe one of the big misses so far has been that there is a bigger chunk of Democratic voters that have not gotten vaccinated or are skeptical of the vaccine than any leader on the left is willing to admit. There is, if you look at, use cities as an example. Cities vote overwhelmingly blue. Monroe County is no exception. Rochester, no exception. But when you're talking about the registration and when you're talking about who these groups of unvaccinated people, what they look like and what they are comprised of, there's this desire, it seems, on the left to paint them as these rural people from the Finger Lakes, I'll say the rural parts of the Finger Lakes, when in reality, it's a mixed bag of both.
But there is something to what they say on the left. There certainly is. The last time I saw the figure, it was 91% of Biden voters were vaccinated, 50% of Trump voters. So that's part of it, but it's a bigger and more nuanced picture than that. It's a combination of things. In some areas, I think it's education. Those of us in the media, we think everyone consumes media and everybody hangs on our every word all the time. Spoiler alert, they don't sometimes. They don't. So I think some people aren't getting the message.
Yeah.
As hard as it would seem to believe, I think if you went into some inner cities and said, you can go to your corner drugstore and get this, they might not know. Yeah. So it's a nuanced picture. And again, I know in Rochester they've been having these kind of community block parties with various incentives. The governor just came out with the scholarship incentive now for kids. Although I said this morning, this is the state that couldn't put together an unemployment website. How are they going to track a 5-year-old 15 years from now when he shows up for his free education?
Yeah. Well, and so the other component of that, I think, is, at what point does it matter? Right? Like in terms of the pandemic, we're still seeing spread among vaccinated folks. And that's not to say anything negative about the vaccine. It's just a reality. So if the goal of getting everyone vaccinated is so that all of pandemic era restrictions, including masking in public places and things like that, can go away, I'm not sure we're ever going to get there. So it becomes, it feels like there's a lot of urgency to get people vaccinated so that we can get there, when in reality the message should be, let's just do this so we don't have 10 or 20,000 people very sick over the next 4 to 5 months while everybody's inside because the weather's terrible in upstate New York.
I think the big test will be in these next few months, because at this time last year, I think nationally, but certainly here in New York, there was a pretty good size upswing from about Thanksgiving. We hit our second peak. Our first peak in New York was around April 2020. That's still by far the biggest one.
Yep.
But we hit a second lower peak in around January of 2021. At that point, very few people were vaccinated. The vaccine had just barely begun to roll out. So now with 60% or more vaccinated, kids becoming vaccinated, I think there's a decent chance we don't see that surge. And I think the best we can hope for at this point, I don't think COVID goes away. I think it's around to stay. But I think we turn it into a manageable risk.
Right.
Something that we don't worry about dying from. Again, unless if you're 85 and you have emphysema or something, then yeah, you're going to have to take different precautions, and people will have to take precautions around you. But I think that's when we're going to see how much all the vaccinations has really meant, is between now and about January. If we don't see that big rise up to a second peak, then I think we'll be on the way to the closest thing to normalcy that we're going to get.
Well, I think it's also interesting, too, because obviously tying all of this to let's get back to normal, there's really been a miss, I think, in how positive cases have been covered, and we've talked about it a little bit on the show here, just in terms of a positive case who's vaccinated versus a positive case who's unvaccinated, or simply being reported as just a positive case with no context at all. And it's interesting because just a couple weeks ago, my wife was pretty sick, not COVID sick, but just in general flu sick, and it was kind of tricky trying to find a COVID test, one at the drugstore that you could just pick up, do at home, and move on with your life. Interesting because, just this week I started to see more and more stories, especially in Rochester and Syracuse markets, about drugstores literally being short on these COVID tests, these instant swabs at home. Now, of course, you've got different kinds of tests. You've got your instant tests, your PCR tests. You've got all these different kinds of tests, the kinds of tests you go get at a clinic versus the kind you can do at home. But the kind you can do at home, I think, are probably the ones being overused, if I'm just kind of prognosticating about, what is what. For people who work in healthcare, I understand why these immediate tests are so important. My wife works in healthcare. It's important that she gets tested and she knows what she is or is not when she's going to and from work. That said, the general public, it seems like there's this breaking happening now where we're kind of starting to get back into our old habits. And I mean I'm sick, but I got to go to work. I just got to go. Or I got to go to the... And it's like we have completely forgotten the lesson we learned, right? Which is, if you're sick, stay home. Whether it's a cold, the flu, or COVID, the random people you interact with over the subsequent 72 hours when you're most contagious, from that moment when you start to realize you're sick, none of them want to be sick with whatever it is you have. So I think there's unfortunately, the instant tests have kind of had a negative consequence, I think, on how people are approaching it. They test negative for COVID and they're like, oh, well, I don't feel that bad. I can keep going to work. I can go to the store. I can go do all these things. And it completely breaks with the messaging that we had just hammered for 16 months. And to me, that's by far the biggest miss, because now we're heading into winter when all of these things, whether it's a cold, the flu, or COVID, can spread a whole lot easier. Oh, and by the way, people had been last year largely wearing masks. So the flu is getting ready to come back and strike with vengeance, I'm sure.
Yeah, there's definitely that factor, especially in certain segments of jobs. Some of the lower wage hourly jobs out there, the feeling is, if I don't come in, I could lose my job. So I don't know.
Well, we just talked about it a couple weeks ago. Last time we did the show, we talked about the study that showed that a pretty high percentage of folks were afraid to call into work.
Yeah.
And maybe it's not a threat. Maybe it's just literally, I can't afford to lose a day's pay.
Because
I don't have the time off. So that kind of thing is what I'm also thinking about.
So maybe, we have on the left, we have a push for more family leave, and I think New York just expanded its family leave policy recently. Maybe we need a sick leave policy where workers can be assured they're going to get paid if they take a day off, and maybe employers are subsidized a certain percentage of that or something, along with another messaging campaign encouraging that. I mean, pie in the sky stuff.
That policy sounds way too logical.
Well,
it sounds like it makes way too much sense to ever actually happen.
It's just, I look at all the things, we're subsidizing. The governor just announced a big subsidy program for the tourism industry, but not for other industries that were affected. So there's always this resistance, especially on the right, to big government, which means spending money. But that train left a long time ago. We spend money on a lot of things. So why not something like this? Why not a program that says to workers, look, sick workers coming to work is not a good thing, so let them stay home. We'll pay them, but we'll reimburse you a percentage, of what you have to do, because then you got to bring somebody in. If you're working at the 7-Eleven and you can't make your shift, they got to call somebody else in. So they got to pay them, and under this program they'd pay you. So maybe there's an incentive there to make that more realistic, because that's it's the same thing. We had the the young child that fell into the grease trap because his mother couldn't get childcare and had to bring the young child to work. There's still a disconnect between our work-centered lives and all the other things that we have to try to juggle along with that.
Yeah, and it's interesting because you just segued really well into that next topic, which is tourism recovery. And the state's obviously going to be dumping hundreds of millions of dollars. I want to say it was like $450 million or something to that tune, into trying to help businesses that were impacted by the pandemic recover from it. Now, I have so many questions and so many, frankly, issues with how this is being executed. One, they're making this pivot in what is going to be the dead of winter, which is just not tourism time. If you're from anywhere in New York State, it's just not tourism time. Two, they're making it kind of isolated away from the worker issue, which is that you have two things happening. You have wages going up, and you have employees that have more, workers who have more power than they ever have before in this whole relationship. And you have some small businesses who have been saying, pretty much ad nauseum for the last several months, they can't afford to pay anymore. So, and I'm not really sure how this $450 million program gets into addressing that in any meaningful way, mostly because I know that if those things were going to be addressed, it would cost a lot more than $450 million. Like in terms of state government, $450 million is kind of like taking a 20 out of your pocket and using it at the gas station to buy a pack of gum and walking out. Like, this is not, we see these big spends all the time. I'm just not sure this will make a difference. Do you feel any differently about that?
I don't know how big a difference it'll make, but I have the same issues I always have. Number one is, when you do this for one segment, why not another? Why aren't local newspapers getting subsidies, and local media that have been suffering for a long time and who got clobbered? Yeah. Our radio station got clobbered during the pandemic in terms of advertising. A lot of businesses just said, we got no customers, we got nothing to advertise for. Yeah. And so we hung on and tightened the belts and made it through. That's number one. The other thing I wonder about is, under this program, you're subsidized for bringing back workers for 6 months. Are we going to see businesses bring back workers, take the subsidy, and then silently, under the radar, cut people loose in 6 months?
It's a question. And at that point, we'll be entering the actual scene, and also implementation. And, like everything when it comes to these state programs, implementation is always a nightmare. We've been hearing from the restaurant industry who through the federal program were supposed to be bailed out during the pandemic, and only like 30% of the restaurants that applied for funds through the Revitalization Act actually got money, which is just a mind-blowingly small number.
And the other problem with all of these programs, and restaurants are a good segment to focus on, is that right now, businesses that are not doing well are all screaming COVID.
Right.
And that's not the only reason businesses fail. I mean, there was just a story today about a restaurant in Auburn that's closing. Well, restaurants close all the time. Something like 50% of new ones fail. So are we subsidizing people who just didn't make good decisions and didn't run their businesses well? Because some businesses have thrived during the pandemic. I mean, some restaurants have done very well because they changed the way they did things. We talked about during the takeout era, some were very good at their messaging, and they let their customers know when they were open. They gave multiple ways to order. They made it easy. Others, you couldn't find a menu that was not 3 years old. You didn't even know what there was to order. So it's become sort of the catch-all for any business that isn't doing well. Well, it's because of COVID, and I want my subsidy.
Yeah, and the last topic we have today is a staffing issue, nursing homes. We find out now that the newest wrinkle in the healthcare staffing crisis, it basically comes down to nursing homes having to compete with hospitals for employees and for workers. What does it tell us about the problem? What about a possible solution? There's been some talk, at least recently, about kind of a Peace Corps solution, where there's a work for education idea floated, where if you want to become a nurse, you work in the hospital trains you, educates you, or the nursing home educates you, and then at the end of that, you promise to work for 2, 3, 4 years, whatever the case may be, in kind of like a state of play situation. I'm not sure that is necessarily the answer, because I think at the end of the day, we have a supply shortage that has to be addressed in the short term before you can start to do the backfilling because you don't have any bench, right? Like you can't sub players in off the bench if you don't have a bench. And right now you're playing 2 or 3 man down. I think, to me, it feels like the answer is address the money problem first, absorb the cost, what that means, and then move forward with a better solution in 2 or 3 or 4 years so that 5 to 10 years from now we're never back in this situation again. Now the for-profit healthcare business is clearly a part of the issue, but at the end of the day, name the healthcare facility. Despite the fact that we're coming out of a pandemic when people have needed more medical care and attention than ever before, name a facility that's larger than it was 10 or 20 years ago around you or around, I don't care wherever you are. Geneva General is smaller, Soldiers and Sailors is smaller, Auburn Community is smaller, Newark Wayne's smaller. Virtually all of them are smaller, if not more specialized. So those things, I think, are just realities that have to be addressed in healthcare, and nursing homes have, there's got to be some money to get people to work.
Whether it's healthcare or any other industry, I think just from a purely economic standpoint, what we've seen is that workers have been underpaid for a long time. So now that there are all these openings, and I business owners have got to just be throwing stuff at their screen when they see me say this every time. But if you can't, if I'm selling apples and I'm selling them for $10 a piece and I'm not selling any, what am I going to do? I'm going to go down to 5 and then 4 and then 3, and then at some point I'll reach a price where people will say, yeah, I'll take an apple. It's no different with labor. So if people aren't coming to work for you at $15 an hour, then you're going to have to offer them 17 or 18 or 20. At some point you'll reach a price where they'll say yes and you're fully staffed. Now, that increases your costs. Yes, it does. So now you, as a smart businessman, have got to figure out what you've got to do to make what you need to make. Maybe you can't make as much profit as you used to. Maybe that's what economics is telling us, is that businesses were making more profit than they should and workers weren't getting enough, and maybe that has to be equalized somewhere. I mean, I don't mean to make it into too simple a thing, but just from simple economics, if you can't sell something or buy something at a given price, then the price changes. That's free market economics at their most basic.
And to be fair, I think a restaurant business model is much different, or should be much different, than, say, a hospital.
Right. I mean, restaurants are on tight. That's why they fail. It's a tight margin. Yeah. I mean, you make, 1% or something of what you spend comes back. So, I mean, it's not a high profit model to begin with.
So we're going to be talking about a lot of that stuff, but that is it for today. Ted, where can folks listen to you for the next 7 days?
7 wake-ups and counting. Finger Lakes Morning News on Finger Lakes News Radio. In Auburn, that's 96.3 and 1590 WAUB. And in Geneva, it's 106.3 and 1240 WGVA.
All right. For Ted Baker, I'm Josh Durso. We'll be back next week with another episode of the Debrief podcast. Until then, check out FingerLakes1.com for the latest news, weather, sports, and podcasts from the heart of the Finger Lakes region. Later, folks.